Good afternoon and welcome to this public meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. My name is Julian Morse. I'm the MLA for Frame Lake. I'm the chair of this committee. Today, Government Operations will receive our last statutory officer presentation from the Northwest Territories Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner, who will report their 2023-24 annual report to committee. Please note that this meeting is being live streamed to the Assembly's social medias channel, and I believe that we are also live on TV this afternoon. I will now ask members in the room and online to introduce themselves for the record. I'll start with Ms. Whalen Armstrong. Just hold on a sec. I think we're just getting the mic switched over there.
Jane Whalen Armstrong, MLA for Mopi, Clutha Region. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Robert Hawkins, MLA for Yellowknife Centre, and I'm happy to be here as always. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I'll go to the online members now, starting with Ms. Reid.
Good afternoon, Kate Reid, MLA for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Denny Rogers. I'm the MLA for Inuvialuit Lake. Welcome, Mr. Fox, and look forward to the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we also have Janine Jakin, our committee advisor, and Cynthia James, committee clerk, with us today. So to help us have a smooth meeting, I'd just like to remind Mr. Fox, our witness, and all members to direct all questions and comments through myself as the chair and wait to be recognized before speaking. It'll help us with our audio video. And I'm going to pass it on to the Commissioner, Mr. Andrew Fox, to go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you very much for taking the time out to hear the report on our annual report. It was a little bit late getting filed this year due to some translation difficulties, but I don't think that's held anybody up too much. In any event, next year we'll probably try and get it in even earlier. The report, as I'm sure you know, is required both under the Access to Information and Privacy Act and the Health Information Act. Both of them require this annual report to be laid before the Assembly. And one of the key parts of it is to assess the effectiveness of the legislation. It's to report on the activities of the Commissioner and any recommendations or other matters of note. I'm not sure if anyone's had a chance to go through the report fully. I don't intend now to go through that with a fine-tooth comb. There's probably not enough time to do that, so I'm going to hit some highlights. But what I will note, now I can't see the presentation, Mr. Chair. I wonder if we could have the presentation up somewhere. And if we could go to slide 3, please. Is there an object I need to point this towards? There we are. Thank you. The report's divided into a number of sections. There's some financial reporting. There's some statistics about our office activities. There's some summaries of review reports where recommendations were not followed. Some discussion about some trends and issues, and there are 10 recommendations. Those are summarized in a list on page 23. I'm not going to go through all of them, but as I pointed out on the slides, numbers 1, 3, 8, and 10 are suggestions regarding changes to legislation, which I'd like to draw your attention to. And recommendations 2 and 6 are perhaps of particular importance because they are about assessing the effectiveness of the Act and particularly how it's currently being implemented. So in terms of financial reporting, just a couple of details. We have our new Assistant Commissioner, Megan Holzapfel, who started with us in July of 2023. She brought with her a wealth of government experience and real enthusiasm for the work of our office. We were without an Assistant Commissioner for several months, and during that time we were able to save a bit of money on salary, and between that and some other ebb and flow, we were able to cover the cost of moving our office without needing any extra funds from the Legislative Assembly. The new office, our move was a bit delayed due to the fire evacuation, but otherwise it went off without a hitch. We've been in the space for 9 months, I think now, 10 months. And I would say that it is very functional, it's fit for purpose. We don't see any difficulties with it, and I can say that we didn't, because of the way things worked out, we didn't need any additional finances last year, and I don't foresee us needing any increases in the near future anyway. In terms of the sort of statistical reporting that's in a number of places, last time I was before this committee, there's a request for some sort of year-on-year statistical representations to help sort of give some context to what the numbers were. We've done that. Be interested to hear if there was enough of it or you want more of it, if it was helpful. But I think some of the charts do sort of help visually create some meaning and context for some of those numbers. I'm going to get into a short discussion, but I think an important discussion about what the legislation's for and particularly what does our office do. The section, I'm trying to get the slide to move. There we go. Nope, I've gone too far. Four. So one back from here. Nope, should be that one. The Access to Information Act has a number of purposes identified for it at the beginning of it. The first one being giving the public a right of access to records held by public bodies. I would call that the prime focus of that legislation, and it's going to be a focus of some comments that I make later. It's also about preventing unauthorized collection, use, or disclosure of personal information. This is the privacy piece. And lastly, providing for an independent review of decisions made under this Act. And that's where my office's activities come in. We are the oversight body for the government, public bodies administration of their duties under this Act. So under the Health Information Act, we also have a role, and it is somewhat different in the sense that that Act is there also to govern collection, use, disclosure, destruction of personal health information. And it is expressly a balance between recognizing the right of individuals to their privacy and also recognizing the right of individuals to access their personal health information and the need for health information custodians to access and use that information when they're delivering health services. It is a bit of a balancing act. In my view, the Act is actually quite prescriptive. It's quite detailed, and in its attempts to control how those health information custodians collect, use, and disclose personal health information. It's a long, convoluted, sometimes very complex Act, lots of rules, lots of ways things can go slightly wrong. Because personal health information is, I would say, inherently sensitive, the Act provides for quite extensive oversight, and I say extensive in the sense that any breach of privacy that occurs, so on any unauthorized collection or use or disclosure of personal health information at whatever scale is reportable to our office. So last time I was here, I got the sense that there was maybe some ambiguity or lack of understanding of what our office does. Slide 6 is an attempt at a really distilled summary of that, but I'm going to go into it a little bit more. Firstly, we'll start with the Health Information Act. Health information custodians are, as I said, required to give my office notice of all privacy breaches. So when that happens, and when I say health information custodians, I'm talking about, it's a defined term, but which has some complexity to it, but basically it means all the health authorities, it means the Department of Health, and it means doctors, pharmacists, and there may be a handful of others. But they are all positively obliged to notify our office if there is a breach of privacy, and then it's our job to investigate the circumstances of it and decide what, if anything, needs to be done. We're looking firstly at mitigating any potential harms that may have occurred when a breach happens, and then perhaps in a more long-term view, what, if anything, should be done to prevent similar things from happening in the future. Not all breaches result in formal review reports. Indeed, if we have done a report on a similar matter, we generally wouldn't repeat it. If matters have been dealt with quickly and it's not of any particular significance, correspondence with the information custodian is generally enough. Now, individuals are entitled to be notified as soon as reasonably possible when a breach occurs. And individuals are entitled to ask for a review. So if health authority calls somebody up or writes to them, notice has to be in writing. They have a right to come to our office and ask us to review what happened. And that notice provides information so that an individual who may not be familiar with the Act or their rights under it at least gets some information about where our office is, how to contact us, etc. Having said that, most of our work is dealt with in the context of breach notices from health information custodians. It's not coming from individuals. So, as I said, we will sort of come to a conclusion about what would be a useful response, and it doesn't often go all the way to a formal review report, but when it does, we will make recommendations, and then the authority will have a certain amount of time to give a formal response to those recommendations and say whether they agree or not, and if they do agree, then they have an obligation to do something positively about that. Under the Access to Information Act, privacy breach requirements are somewhat different. There is, firstly, a threshold for reporting. Not all breaches need to be reported. If a breach poses what's called a material risk to an individual, then the breach has to be reported to my office. If the breach reaches a higher threshold of a reasonable risk of significant harm, then the individual has to be notified, and my office may be in a position to conduct a review and make recommendations. And again, there would be a formal response process by which the public body would have to say what they were going to do. Now again, the focus there is what can be done to mitigate any harms that might have happened as a result of this incident, and also what can be done to avoid a recurrence of a similar event in the future. So in terms of the protection of privacy function, what we do is we receive reports of breaches of privacy because we don't know what's going on inside public bodies. And then we try and review that and investigate it and determine what would be an appropriate response, first to protect the rights of any particular individual and their privacy concerns, and then also to look at what could be done to avoid this happening in the future. Now, the other part of our office, and this is under the access to information portion, is to be the oversight office for access to information. Now, the Act says that one of its first purpose is to give a right of access to individuals to records held by public bodies. Now, if the public body is a GNWT department or housing, Northwest Territories Housing, access requests are now directed to the Access and Privacy Office, and that is a unit located within the Department of Justice. Sometimes I've noted there's confusion about who does what and whether our office is the Access Privacy Office, and that happened as recently as when we were getting this annual report translated. So it's not necessarily well known that the Access Privacy Office is not us, but it is not us. That office is the one-stop window for individuals looking to get access to some government record. Now, they only act for some of the public bodies, just the government departments and housing. The other 22 public bodies that are listed in the schedule to the Act are still handling these requests on their own. The process for gaining access is to, essentially you fill out a form. The individual fills out a form, identifies what they're looking for, what department they think might have that information, and the Access Privacy Office will help facilitate that. They will try and, as I understand it, they will actively try and clarify the request and then direct it to the right department. The department still has to look for the records that come up, and then those are given back to the Access Privacy Office, and that's where what I would call the hard work of preparing those documents comes in, because they have to be reviewed, and particularly with regard to the various exceptions to disclosure that are in Division D or B of the Part 1 of the Act. Individuals have not an absolute right, but a guaranteed right to access to records, but it is subject to a host of exceptions. Access Privacy Office has to be alive to all of those, and some of them are discretionary, some are mandatory. Sifting through that, particularly when you've got a request that may involve hundreds, if not thousands of records, is complicated and very time-consuming. And then it will get, sometimes it requires consulting either with other public bodies or with private individuals if their personal information might be in these records somewhere. So all of which to say it's kind of complicated, it's kind of time-consuming. Often what will happen is that the Access Privacy Office needs more time. This was a fundamental change to the Act in 2019, and those changes came into force in 2021. Prior to that time, public bodies could give themselves more time. The way it was implemented, it was not unusual for public bodies to grant themselves more time on more than one occasion. And there was no hard limit to that other than the phraseology was a reasonable period. And what would be a reasonable period in a particular time seems to have been simply up to the discretion of the public bodies. And I don't think it's surprising that sometimes those periods were quite long, and that may have had something to do with many public bodies not having any funded positions for ATIP coordinator activity. So there seemed to have been, in 2019, a decision by the legislature to deal with what was, I think, a perception that things were taking too long on the access to information side. And the response seems to have been to provide more oversight outside the public bodies. So now, if a public body needs more time, they can grant themselves one 20-day extension. After that, they have to come to my office and they have to justify it. And there are relatively limited reasons. They're set out in Section 11 of the Act. There are limited reasons that they can use to justify an extension. What we've noted is that, and I should preface this saying, if they don't apply for an extension before the time period's up, there's nothing really I can do anymore in terms of extending time. They have to apply for a time extension before their time is up. And what I have seen over the last year and a half, 2 years, is that we have seen more requests for review based on a deemed refusal, which is essentially the public body hasn't given the response yet within the time. And at the same time, we have seen decreasing requests for time extensions. So, the public bodies are running out of time, and they're not coming to ask us for more time. And unfortunately, they seem to be running out of time more. Now, one of the changes to the Act that happened was that there's now a requirement for the Minister of Justice, who has the control of the Access Privacy Office. The Minister of Justice has to bring forward a report from all the public bodies about how access to information was actioned in the previous year. So there's one of those reports on the record now for 2022, 2023. And I think, as I said the last time I was here, the report indicates that public bodies were late 54% of the time. So, and late means didn't provide it within the timelines allowed under the Act. Doesn't mean they had to come and ask for more time. As long as they get it done within the time period allowed initially or within any extension, that's in time. So 54% of the time they weren't delivering within the statutory time periods. So from what I have seen over the last year, that isn't getting any better. I just did a review report for someone who asked for, I don't know that it was a terribly lengthy access request, but it was for a important request, and the dates were extended once for 20 days, which they're allowed to do, and then there was a subsequent request for a 55 business day extension to allow for consultation with third parties. 55 days is what it works out to when all the time periods for that process are added up, and that's generally speaking a rubber stamp request. Unfortunately, that request that request wasn't processed, and on day 54 of that 55-day extension is when apparently the Access Privacy Office was able to send out the consultation letters. So then there was no delivery of the request, and the reasons were, I would say admirable candor, saying overworked, too many other demands on the time, and it simply wasn't able, they were not able to do what was needed to be done within the time available. There's not much I can do at that point, except when we get the request for review, I'm able to make an order saying you will deliver forthwith upon the receipt of this order. And the Act says essentially that that means you actually have 20 business days after you receive the order to do it. May or may not happen. But the problem we're grappling with here is that not one of inflexibility in the Act, like should I be able to just deliver more extensions for any number of reasons? I would say not. I say, well, what the problem here is a lack of staff in the Access Privacy Office. I've said it before to this committee. I'm here saying it again, as unequivocally as I can. There were some statements made in the legislature earlier this assembly to the effect that there was support for seeing access to access to information being provided within the timelines. And I know that there were 2 positions that were actually approved for the Access Privacy Office in this current budget cycle. However, those 2 positions were for positions that were otherwise going to be sunsetted on March 31 because they were only term positions. So the problem of not enough people, too much work, has been enduring since essentially the Access Privacy Office existed. Now, I have some theories about how the history of the whole project of access to information may have led to that, but fundamentally that is the struggle that that office has. And frankly, hats off to them, to the actual staff there, that they are not leaving. Because I'm confident that many days when they go into the office, they go in knowing that at the end of the day, they're not going to get done what needs to be done, which is a bit difficult. I know this committee can't make decisions or make appropriations, but some of you are legislators, and you can have a word with those who might be in charge of that. The Access to Information Protection Privacy Act is up for review within the first 18 months of this assembly. The Health Information Act is also up for review next year. This might be a good time to get some recommendations put together to help the Access Privacy Office accomplish its objectives. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. I think that the Access Privacy Office is a centralized agency to help the government departments field with sometimes significant access to information requests, both in number and quantity of records, is a good model, because individual departments will have sporadic experience with access requests, and it can be confusing, it can be complicated. There are certainly 2 or 3 sort of back burner legal issues that we're sort of continuing to go through with the Access Privacy Office, and I'm confident that there are going to be more, because like everything else, it's in the details. So they need help, because fundamentally this is about a statutory obligation of the public bodies. And they have set up this Access Privacy Office within one of the public bodies, Justice, to help them all. But the money hasn't been going with them. And that really is an untenable proposition. And because of the additional oversight, we're now much more aware of these delays. I don't know if they're more delayed or less delayed than they were before, but we're certainly a lot more aware of it. So in that sense, having additional oversight is useful, but it doesn't actually lead to individuals getting their access to records within the statutory time. And being late more than half the time is not a reasonable standard for service. It is self-evidently indicating complacence on the part of the public bodies. So that's why recommendation 2 is there. Recommendation 2 says public bodies should review their legal obligations to respond to accessed information requests and evaluate their capacity to provide responses within the legislated time periods. They should also ensure, either collectively or individually, that the Access Privacy Office is appropriately resourced so that it can assist public bodies to respond reliably to accessed information requests within the legal time periods and to comply with the relevant procedural requirements. And I'll just close this piece by saying those legal requirements are reasonably well known. The procedural requirements are reasonably well known. I think the Access to Information Office, Access Privacy Office does a good job. They have reasonable procedures, but it's getting bogged down. And complacency and just say, oh well, does not fare well when these are time periods set in statute. And complacency looks like due regard for the rule of law is not being had. And I think that should give concern to everybody. So as typically happens, I haven't stuck to my script at all. There are 10 recommendations. They're appearing on slides 8 and 9, which I think everybody's probably had a chance to look at. So in all candor, this was the point that I wanted to hammer on, which is not to say that the other recommendations are not worthy of your consideration, but I think most of them are fairly straightforward. Each one of them is, if you look at the list, the page references to where those come from in the annual report are there. So what I would propose now is to say thank you and to solicit any questions you might have.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Fox. And yeah, certainly I think you've hammered the point home for sure. And I'll now turn it over to committee members for questions. First, I have Ms. Reed online who's indicated she has some questions. And members, if you just want to let me know either through the online chat or in person, of course, if you have questions. So over to you, Ms. Reed, to start.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Fox, for your presentation. So, as we've heard from you today and previously, you're speaking a lot about the Access to Privacy Office capacity. And in your report, you note that adjusting timelines for what's required under the Act is one solution that you've heard Premier Simpson speak to as the Minister of Justice, but you don't see that as a permanent solution. So where we are looking as a committee and some of the information we've been briefed on is that other jurisdictions are looking at administrative monetary penalties, or AMPs as they're known. Could you speak to the committee about your thoughts on whether AMPs might be a tool for our jurisdiction? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reed. Over to Mr. Fox for an answer.
Thank you, Member Reed, for that question. Administrative monetary penalties, or another way of putting that is giving out tickets for minor breaches of law or regulations. It's a possibility. I mean, the whole idea behind putting penalties onto activities is to deter that activity. I personally am not that convinced that AMPS would help much, because you're talking about a government finding itself. Taking money out of one pocket and putting it into the other isn't likely to have much, if any, effect. And it's unlikely to, well, I'm not sure I could draw a straight line between imposing a penalty for being late and having the Access Privacy Office, for instance, getting more staff, because the public body that gets fined may not be the Department of Justice. You know, that not that money is the only thing to chart, but it can help you see where emphasis is put. And I mentioned history. You know, when or prior to the Act being amended, individual public bodies all responded independently to access to information requests. They had their own coordinators, and there were people who were identified to do that. But most, I was rather surprised to learn when I got into this position, most don't or didn't have funding for those positions. Those were corner of the desk, some director or what have you was doing that in addition to their other full-time duties. That led to prioritization of work, and often it seemed that the access to information work was not seen as a higher priority or as high a priority as some of the other sort of line item policy work that the departments were engaged with. So if individual public bodies are responsible for all the work and you were to impose a penalty on that public body, maybe you could make an argument that that would be a useful approach. Although I still think there's a problem with government finding itself. But with the Access Privacy Office doing what I would call the lion's share of the work in most cases when it comes to access to information work, they're located within the Department of Justice. And so, although they're helping, they're doing the work for their public bodies, and it is the head of those public bodies that have the responsibility. But if, say, Department of ECC is late, are you going to fine ECC, or are you going to fine Department of Justice? And I don't think that AMPS are going to really, I doubt that they would help. I would be pleased to be proved wrong, but I'm not sure that that's the right path, because the problem isn't people deliberately ignoring the obligations. The problem is there just aren't enough of them to do the work.
Thank you, Mr. Fox. Ms. Reid, I have you for a follow-up question if you want.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Fox. I appreciate you detailing your thoughts on AMPS. I would tend to agree with you. I don't think they're necessarily the way forward for the problem that we are facing. You did speak a little earlier in your presentation about the APO writing back that the delay was simply too much work, not enough time, not enough people. I know you seem to have a very good grasp on the staffing levels of the Access and Privacy Office. Knowing what you know about the quantity of requests, what would you feel would be an adequate capacity level for that Access and Privacy Office? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reid. Over to Ms. Fox for an answer.
Thank you for that question. There's a natural inclination to want to just pull out my dartboard and say, 2 more positions, or 3, or 1, or 5. I don't know. In all candor, I don't know. What I would say is that is the salient question. What is the staffing level that's reasonably required in order to meet the work demands of that office? And I have asked and searched for some sort of analysis that would have been done prior to setting up the Access Privacy Office in anticipation of taking on the duties that it's having, or that it has. And I'm not aware that there ever was one. I know the Access Privacy Office existed within the Department of Justice prior to 2021, and it was doing advisory work in addition to helping with actual access requests for the Department of Justice, but it was not acting as in the capacity it is now for all the other public bodies. So when they took that responsibility over, their complement was increased from 4 to 5. And I think it's unequivocal that that wasn't enough. But what would be enough, I think, would require, to give a real answer to that, would require some analysis. Someone would really need to sit down and crunch some numbers, and someone with some familiarity, not just of access to information, but office procedures. I mean, who knows if there could even be efficiencies found. But I think there's some analysis required before taking a guess at what might be an appropriate staffing level. I mean, one could always sort of approach it piecemeal, say, well, let's add one, see how that works, add another, see how that works. I'm not necessarily a big fan of that approach, but I'm also confident that the APO would take whatever they're offered at this point.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Rogers, I have you up next online.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Fox, for the presentation. You may have answered this, and this is kind of along the same lines as Ms. Reed, I think, but maybe some clarity for me. I'm certainly not an expert in this field. One of the, I guess, the big takeaways from this is that you're saying that 54% of the time, the departments are not delivering within the statutory time commitment, so they're not doing that job. And right now, if I understand correctly, is that right now, I guess if the public body does run out of time and doesn't, I guess, request an extension, there is currently no, lack of a better word, no penalties in place for that. So if you can clarify that, and if there's no penalties in place for that, is that's something that you're saying is one of the key issues we need to address. And I guess, again, following up on what Ms. Reed had said, staffing could correct this problem and not have to worry about the penalties. Am I kind of on the right track there? Am I kind of off base? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fox.
Thank you for your question. I think that the short answer is yes, but with an explanation. There is a need for more staff. One of the problems with the current situation, or one of the aspects of the current situation, is that the Act only allows me to give extensions for limited reasons, and only if the request is made during the time period, like before it's expired. I think the logic to that is there was a determination that there needed to be stricter controls on extensions of time so that access requests could get out the door within the timelines. So a public body needs to come and ask before they run out of time and not wait until the time's run out and then come back, say, 1 day or 1 month or 1 year after and say, can we have more time? So I think the logic of not being able to do that, not to be able to entertain requests after time periods have expired, looks purposeful and it makes sense. That answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rogers for follow-up.
Yeah, just along the same lines. Okay, so now I understand. So would lifting those restrictions help? I mean, the ultimate goal here is to get the request, get the information out in a timely fashion. I mean, I assume that the time frames that's laid out in the in legislation are enough to get this work done, if we had the appropriate staff to do it, or if staffing levels were at appropriate level that to get this work done. So I understand, you know, they want to put restrictions around extending the time because they want to get the information out to the folks that have requested it. So are you then advocating then to have less restrictions on the extensions, or would you say it's more important to either have penalties and or obviously more staff, as we discussed, to get the work done so we're not in this situation? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Over to Mr. Fox for.
Thank you for that question. I would approach the answer this way. The legislature, since 1996, when this act came into force, has set out some expectations for time for public bodies to deliver their responses when people submit access requests. It used to be initially 30 days. Now it's 20 business days. Also, the acts have always recognized that sometimes you'll need more time. So there used to be a provision that a public body could just give themselves an extension of a reasonable period. Now they have less freedom. They can give themselves one 20-day extension. After that, they have to come to my office before they run out of time and ask for more time. And you know, there are grounds that they would have to satisfy. Now, when those changes were made, and that essentially imported tighter restrictions on the process and external oversight on the process of getting extensions. But the interest is getting the requests responded to in time. And you know, in all candor, one has to scratch one's head and wonder, why would anyone think that simply changing some of the rules would make this work any faster? Because there was no, there wasn't any impediment to things getting out the door faster before, and changing the rules so that now it's 20 business days, not 30 calendar days, or providing a little more oversight in terms of granting extensions, suggests to me that there was a thought perhaps that public bodies just weren't putting the effort in. There may be something to that, but I think what was also going on, and you know, maybe it's a reflection of it, or I'm not sure, but what was going on is they weren't putting any real resources into it either. And when Department of Justice took over responsibility for a lot more of the work for all those other public bodies, they didn't put much more resources into it either. And I don't know that any of the public bodies contributed some of their resources to the Department of Justice to staff up that office well. So the act changed, the rules changed, maybe by creating more oversight, made things a little more strict. But it doesn't seem that anyone really asked themselves the question, well, why is it taking so long? Because I think the obvious answer would be, well, you don't have enough people doing the work. And that didn't change. So there's sort of a, there's actions by the legislature that are intended to speed things up, or at least require that things happen at the speed the legislature has set. But in order to implement that, it's work. You need to devote resources in order to have the work done. And that part didn't seem to get a whole lot of attention. And so I come before you to bring attention to it. That answers your question.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fox. I think you're being quite clear. I'm just going to turn over to members on the floor if they have questions. I'm seeing Ms. Whalen Armstrong.
Thank you. He said, okay, 20 days to respond. So, and you reported here 140 files were opened within this fiscal year. So how many of those files are completed and closed, or is it still open?
Thank you. Mr. Fox.
Thank you for that question. The figure of 140 files, that came from not quite which. I'm not sure which page we're taking that from.
Mr. Fox, I believe it's 62 files for ATIP and 78 files under the Health Information Act.
A little arithmetic goes a long way. Okay. In terms of how many are still open, how many we've closed, I can't actually give you a precise number on that. I can say that we have been advancing in terms of getting caught up. We definitely sort of felt, it literally felt like coming under siege when I first started in this job in 2020, because COVID had a significant effect, not just on the productivity of the office, but more so in terms of the number of files, both privacy breaches and access requests that our office had. And we certainly fell behind. And we had to do some staffing in there a couple of times, because we hired a new investigator, and then our assistant commissioner retired, and so we had to hire another one of those. So there were some interruptions that way. But we are well, I would say I'm quite happy with the pace at which we're cleaning up the old stuff and getting more current. In terms of how many of the ones that we opened are closed, I don't know. I can't tell you that today. But certainly, just because we open a file doesn't mean that we're going to do a review report on each one, for instance. Often these can be resolved informally, sometimes just by conversations. Sometimes there's just simply confusion on the part of either the public body or the individual about what it is that they're looking for, and sometimes fresh eyes can help make that clear. Sometimes some more, shall I say, disciplined conversation with the public body can help clarify what would be an appropriate path forward. Sometimes we have suggested, that in light of what appears to be maybe a mistake, that the public body have a do-over, and sometimes they do with real success. So ultimately, the goal is to have the complaint, whether it's regarding breach of privacy or Access to Information Act issue, to be well addressed. But so sometimes we will close files in a week, but if it goes to a full review, it will be months, many months. And I think we're under a year at this point, but we're not at the 90 business days that the Act hopes for.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Whalen Armstrong, do you have a follow-up?
So yes, thank you for the information. Thank you, that was good. It's good to know. And I see here too, in your report, fax breach notification by year. So 2021, 2022 was the highest breach. And I know that that was the highest breach, but in other department or with the agency, but it's been reduced now, there's not as much as before. But that was because the fax breach, it was in the news before where, wrong number punch or not, wrong numbers dialing a wrong number. But anyways, so with, I guess, not much have changed with the emails. I guess this also goes for the emails as well too, where, sometimes you have an employee, because there's so many changes it's happening within the GNWT, and a lot of transfers, a lot of people leaving, so there's always movement, and so, like, for example, today we're dealing with Andrew Fox, and then tomorrow we don't know where he's going to be within the GNWT. So sometimes you get so used to it, and sometimes because you're in a rush, you dial in Andrew Fox, and then it's like, oh, okay, that was a mistake. So would you consider that a breach of privacy for entering a wrong name? Not knowing that the person changed positions, and so that's within the GNWT, because GNWT are the main employer in the Northwest Territories. So I'm just more concerned with that. Would you consider that a breach?
Thank you, Mr. Fox, for a response.
Thank you for that question. And it's one of those things where you're throwing a pebble into the water and it looks calm, but now it's all disturbed. And I wonder how far it went down. I'm not sure how deep we'll go into this, but let me sort of give you my response. The Act looks at or classifies privacy breaches as unauthorized use, collection, disclosure of personal information. And the Health Information Act is basically the same wording, and it applies to personal health information, which is just a subset of personal information. As I mentioned earlier, the acts do have a slight difference in the way they treat breaches. Under the Health Information Act, any breach is reportable to my office, whereas under the Access to Information Act, Access to Information Protection of Privacy Act, there's a threshold, and really put it this way, really minor stuff doesn't have to get reported to us. And I think the logic of that would be that the Health Information Act deals with personal health information, which is sort of inherently more sensitive than, say, other kinds of personal information. If someone were to send my name and my personal health care number to, say, the Fort Smith Health Center instead of Stanton Territorial Hospital, that would be nominally a breach of privacy under the Health Information Act, because it would be disclosed to someone who wasn't authorized to get it. It was a mistake. And because the mistake involves sending out personal health information, they have to report it. So yes, that would be. Now, what would be the ramifications of that would depend. Now, we would ask some questions about how that happened. Was it that the buttons on the fax machine were so tiny that it was just impossible for someone with big fingers to dial it properly? Perhaps the person had never been trained to use a fax machine. Perhaps there was a stored number from the last person who just sent a fax, and the fax machine had a default that sent it to that number. Those are all things that have happened. There could be any number of reasons why, and by asking questions about things like training, about, did you follow the fax policy? Because, for instance, NTHC has a policy instructing its employees how to send faxes. Did you follow it? Did you know about it? Did you take the mandatory privacy training that would have included a module about sending faxes? And by tracing those sorts of things, you can come to a conclusion. Well, was this just, it was 11 o'clock at night and we had to get this out and I made a mistake? Or was it, we put someone in the position and they didn't have any training and they've never used a fax machine before and didn't know the number, and so they just had to go. The questions can lead you to very different places, and so it can lead you to different conclusions about what you should do to sort of prevent that kind of event from happening again. And not surprisingly, training is one of the things that we continue to recommend as a solution to a number of these kinds of problems.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hawkins, I have you for our first round of questions.
Thank you. I do have some questions specific to the report, but maybe I'll just take some broad ones first on the first round. And you note access to information can be a challenge, and I can appreciate that. I mean, you know, it's like saying, you know, time isn't the same for everyone, you know, in the sense of all strings aren't the same length, you know, so I can appreciate the complexity of trying to get the details of a simple question when you're dealing with, you know, the amounts or mountain of paperwork in a department that sometimes is not appreciated until you get into the challenge. And so I guess I have a question specifically about just general curiosity. Do you find, or can you decide, in other words, can you find that anyone's ever weaponized access to information requests in a way of using that to either irritate or get back at the department? Or a department or public body in some sort. I mean, and that's the question, but just to give a sense that, I mean, anyone can ask for information, that's fine. I don't have issues with that. I'm just thinking that if, say, a disgruntled person starts sending in requests at whatever the nominal fee is, they know that their nominal fee request is going to cause thousands upon thousands of dollars of work. So I'm just curious if anyone's weaponized it, because, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fox.
So thank you for that question. It's difficult to answer that without speculating because you know, we're rarely allowed entry into the mind of an applicant. I can tell you that since I've been there, I've certainly witnessed one instance where I was under the impression that there was mischief going on in terms of access to information requests that seemed to be geared to nothing other than to, as you say, make a department do some work. I can also say that it's not infrequent that applicants are you know, present as people that likely have an axe to grind. Certainly a number of applicants for access to information are people who are unhappy with how they left the employment of the GNWT. However, the first point I would make to really respond to that is that the intention or desire or reasons that an applicant might have to make an access to information request are entirely irrelevant. It is a statutory right, and there is no discussion to be had about whether or not an applicant deserves a response or not. They are entitled by right to it. And absent a public body providing evidence and a request to have some kind of relief on the basis that an applicant is submitting a vexatious request, there's really no discussion about it.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins for follow-up.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think for a large part it does. I'm not questioning the merits of the request. I'm requesting your perspective on people using it and I'm not in any position to say people's questions are fair or reasonable without having to manage them, and I don't manage them. That's not my area, that's not my department, that's not my, say, office, whereas I receive an information. So I wouldn't know, and so hence it's easier, if not more appropriate, just to stress I'm not in the business to decide if they're infectious or not, but I was just curious if, you know, you're seeing in your work that people are using it as that type of mechanism and that formulation. So in some ways it may have been answered. I suspect, if not, it's intrinsically difficult to fully define it as that, but I'm just curious from your observation in your role. Given the fact that back to all information requests aren't equal, and it's sometimes exceptionally difficult to know how big it is until you get into it. And one thing can be very simple. So the other area I wouldn't mind just taking a look at is that what you note in some of your comments earlier, that you said access to information can be challenging. I'm summarizing words, which, you know, to me is a fair statement, regardless who makes that. And a body can either, and then you went on to say, to some degree, a body can either agree or disagree that a breach has happened. You know, and then there's recommendations. My question is built around the so what response. Like, in other words, oh, you broke it, so what? Or I agree with it, so what? You know, what happens next in that sense? Like, if they disagree, from your practice or process, from your vantage point, is what's next if they disagree? Can they just sit on it? And I mean, we're noticing challenges of following through. We're noticing challenges of dealing with things, and I'm just curious on that phase of it. I've got several other questions, but I'll wait to the next round to jump in. And I was just curious on picking up some of the phraseology you had used, you know, when they face the agreed or disagreed disposition of a recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fox.
Thank you for that question. And it depends which act we're dealing with. Under the Health Information Act, if we provide a review report and make recommendations to a health information custodian, that health information custodian has nominally 30 days in which to, or it's 45 days, to respond to the recommendation. And they can either agree to it or say, or decide not to do anything. And they may also decide that they're going to do something else. So there is a requirement for a formal response from the custodian about what they're going to do in regard to our recommendations. And then if they agree to a recommendation, then there's a requirement that they take steps within a certain time to do something. Now, there isn't any requirement that they actually report back to us about what they've done. And actually, one of the recommendations that we've made in here is that perhaps the act could be improved by requiring them to report back to our office what they did after implementing the recommendation. Now, under the Access to Information Act, it's a bit of a different regime because, sticking with breaches of privacy for the moment, we can make recommendations in the instance where a breach has hit that threshold of real risk of significant harm. And if we make a recommendation, the public body has an obligation to actually make a decision in regard to that, and then there is an implementation time period, and there is a requirement to report back to our office on what they've done. So that, in my estimation, that's a pretty good sort of closing the loop function, so that it's clear on the record what was recommended, what was accepted, and what was done. In very limited circumstances, we can make an order, but the circumstances are pretty rare. I haven't seen one come up yet. Now, on the access to information side, it's a different kettle of fish, because with the changes to the Act that came into force in 2021, we now make orders. So if a public body provides a response and the applicant receives it and disputes it, they ask us to review it. We will review the unredacted documents, compare it to the redactions that were made and the explanations given for those redactions, and we will either agree or disagree. If we disagree, we will order that they be disclosed. That order is binding on the government, and they're required to comply with it unless they appeal it. Thus far, there haven't been any appeals. We did have one judicial review that was started last year in regard to a recommendation that we made, but within a few months it was withdrawn. So, so that was, you know, that was in regard to a new section which had never been used before, and I think perhaps there was just some uncertainty about how that was being implemented. But in terms of one of our sort of standard things we do, which is reviewing the responses to access requests, we no longer make recommendations, we make orders about what should be disclosed.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fox. I have one question just to follow up on a thread that we went down in the first round there. And you kind of emphasized that kind of someone needs to figure out, do some analysis on how many staff are needed in order to kind of properly deliver the office's functions. The question that arose for me is, whose responsibility is it? So do you have a suggestion as to who that person is, if not yourself?
Well, it wouldn't be my office. My office has a statutory set of duties, and we operate outside of government, and it would not be seemly, shall we say, for my office to opine about how public bodies actually discharge their duties. That's very much their purview, and I certainly don't have a name of a good sort of management consultant to bring in, and I'm not sure where that expertise might lie, but I suspect that most of what the APO is doing is stuff that other governments do, and many of those functions are probably similar to other things that this government is doing. I think what really is necessary is to do some analysis and ask the question, what do we need to do this properly? Which is fundamentally a different question than, why don't we try this and see how it works?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to a second round of questions, just noting that we are running a bit short on time. Maybe what I'll do is just one question per member, and hey, if we can get to a third round, that's great. I have Ms. Reed first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll try to keep this brief. And just building a little bit on what you were just talking about, Mr. Fox. I will try and frame this in a way that you might feel comfortable answering. So I think that one of the tools in the toolkit, shall we say, for both public bodies and the Access to Privacy Office in the Justice Ministry would be the ability to discuss with applicants the scope and timelines of their request. I find, as someone who has actually processed ATIP requests, that is usually a very good place to start to make the process a little more expedient for all. Would it be your opinion, sir, if we could consider that as possibly a legislative requirement, or would you prefer that would be something kept to the policies of the GNWT's public bodies? Thank you.
Thank you. Over to Mr. Fox for response.
Thank you for that question. It's an important one. Clarification of the scope and timelines of requests is I think, a really key sort of first step in dealing with virtually any access request. Many of the people, not all, but many of the people who apply for access to information are not aware of government processes and the way government keeps records, etc., and they need help. There is a positive duty in Section 7 of the Act for a public body to provide assistance to applicants to ensure that the responses are provided openly, accurately, timely, and completely. The only way to really, or part of the way to discharge that duty to assist, is to make sure that the request is well understood by the public body. Because if you don't know what it is you're being asked for, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to provide it well. And sometimes the individuals who are asking for access to records aren't entirely sure what they're looking for, or how to how to identify or express what it is they're looking for. So, it's one of those things, if you invest a little time up front, you maybe save a lot of time on the back end. And prior to the Access Privacy Office coming on stream, I think this was a bigger problem. I say that advisedly because there were a couple of, what we would affectionately call dog files in my office, where they had been processed by public bodies prior to APO coming on stream, and the asks were extremely broad and unfocused, and perhaps not surprisingly, they generated thousands of pages of records, and they were the responses were ultimately not well received by the applicant. They asked for us to review them, and they had been prepared by people within the public body, people who were not skilled in administering the act, and so you had a whole lot of records that were redacted, perhaps spottily, and many of them didn't appear to be that responsive when really looking at what it was that the individual was seeking. So I guess the short answer to your question is I think that scoping out the precise limits of what an access request is seeking is really important, because it will really define where the public body goes to look, and it will almost certainly make the job easier first to locate, and also it's going to require probably less records be provided, because you can be more certain about whether or not the record is inside or outside the ask. It does take more time at the outset to either correspond or speak to the person to get a sense of whether you've got the clarity or not. And I've certainly seen examples where that didn't happen, and it just becomes very difficult. I will say that for that process to work, there needs to be trust between the individual and the person they're speaking to. And if there isn't that trust there, then suggestions about narrowing the request can sometimes, I think, be interpreted as sort of rebuffing or trying to hide something. With the Access Privacy Office being generally one remove from the actual public body, I think there's a professionalization of that service there that helps engender more trust. And from what I've seen, the APO does do more work in terms of clarifying. And again, if they had more time, they'd probably be able to do it even better.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Whalen Armstrong, I have you next for a question.
Talking about trust, we've come a long ways, especially when dealing and working with the Indigenous people in the small communities, because we do have a trust issues. The Indigenous people do, due to the colonization, the residential school, and all those, So I know that we're still dealing with it till this day, So, but we're working through it. We're dealing with it. We're working with it. So, and I see here breach of notification. So this is regarding the health, according to the report here. And so if there is no next of kin, so what would they do? If there's no next of kin, and to contact, especially with somebody in a hospital or, and they need to contact someone, but there's no next of kin identified. So what would the health professional do? Like, would that be considered breach of trust or a breach of information to contact people, especially within that, with the health system.
Thank you. Yep. Oh,
So that one, um, um, no, I'll let him answer that first, and then if I do have time, if we do have time, yeah, thank you.
okay, thank you. Mr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I could just rephrase the question so I've got it, make sure that I'm understanding it. I think the question is something along the lines of, if a health provider is trying to help a patient and is trying to contact someone about a patient and there's no next of kin, is there a I'm not sure where that goes. Is the question, is it okay to contact someone else?
Yes, because I know that the department is taking access to information and privacy is very important. And I just wanted to know, because I know we had quite a few situations. And there was no next of kin, and people were not contacted, so until it was too late. So because of the breach of information, access to information, because of that, I know it's not the health providers, but it's the legislation that's in place. And if there's no notification, would that be considered? Like if they try to reach out to other people within the community, would that be considered breach of information? And according to your stats, oh, okay, sorry. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, and further to the stats here, breach of information. Breach of notification by health custodians. I know it's not in the report too. NTHSS 2021, 2021, that was during the COVID years. And 2021, 2022, and 2022, 23 fiscal year, it's high, for the breach notifications, especially by NTHSS. Is that related? It's not in your report because I didn't see it. Is that related to the fire evacuations? For 23, I know, but 22, because there was the Hay River and other places that were under evacuations and flooding. So I just wanted to know if that was related to, if that breach is related to the natural disaster. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fox.
Okay, thank you. I'll go back to your first question. I think the problem that you're alluding to is that if a person is being treated and a health information custodian, health center, needs to contact somebody else because the patient is either a minor or perhaps infirm or in some sort of distress, they can't deal with things themselves, who do you go to? So there's certainly provisions when people are sort of registered in the system to identify next of kin or to identify emergency contacts. Now, if a person doesn't have those information fields in their medical records, then there's a problem for a doctor or a nurse or whoever to know who to contact. And the Act does restrict their ability to just sort of come to their own decisions. Now, I think there are and this isn't something that I am terribly familiar with, but I'm relatively confident that there are other ways in terms of determining who would be an appropriate contact. But if you're in a situation where there's nobody identified and immediate family are not available, divulging information to extended family, yeah, I think that can be a problem. And I think that the clear, easy solution is when people should keep their contact information, their emergency contact information up to date. In terms of the question you had about breach notifications, I think we were talking about you were talking about the statistics on page 16 of the annual report, which talks about breach notifications, and there's a year-on-year comparison, and it's broken down by the different health information custodians. I can certainly say that the years 2021, 2022, and 2022-23 are very much. I think those are a function of COVID having come through the system. There were, as you may recall from past reports, a significant number of breaches that came from the operations of the COVID Secretariat, which operated within the Department of Health, but it was somewhat operating independently as well. There were a lot of breach reports that came to us. They came sometimes months, sometimes over a year after the events actually happened. And so we've seen the last of those, I'm confident, but we were receiving them even up until towards the end of last year. So it took a while for those to get through the system. I don't recall any big issue in terms of the evacuations, either from Jean Marie River or Fort Simpson or Hay River. Under this, there were a couple of instances under the Access to Information Act where there was some looseness, I'll put it, in terms of trying to get word out to individuals about what to do.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to maybe first ask our witness if it seems like there's a number of questions for committee, so maybe I'll put it to committee. We were supposed to be done at 3, and I've had at least one member mention to me that they could use a break, and I think our audio-video booth could use a break too. But Mr. Fox, would you be able to come back if committee so chooses to have you back for a few more questions in 10 minutes, or do you have a hard stop at 3? You have a better suggestion. Well, first I'll ask Mr. Fox.
I believe we went through this last time, and I am here at the pleasure of the committee, so I'd happily take a 10-minute break.
Okay, Mr. Hawkins, you had a suggestion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciating the Commissioner's time, perhaps maybe committee could organize and we can put our questions in writing and provide them to him. And that uses committee's time more efficiently as well as the Commissioner's time efficiently. And that way, that's fine. I mean, I'm just thinking that may be more efficient for everyone, still seeking the general, dealing with the general topic at hand. And that said, if we still feel we need, we can call him back as appropriate, and I'm sure he's very agreeable to that process if need be. And that way we're using everyone's time efficiently. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. I think in any case, we'll, I guess, yeah, with that suggestion, we can follow up with written questions if need be. And I will, in that case, call the public portion of the meeting to close. So I wanted to thank Mr. Fox, of course, for your time. And it sounds like there will be a few follow-up questions, which I'm sure you're amenable to answering in writing. And yeah, always appreciate you coming and speaking with committee. As you can see, we always use up our time, so we really appreciate our time with you. So thank you for that. Committee members will take 10 minutes and just come back at 3:10. Thanks.